two, one, two, three, four.
Well, thank you for inviting me here. I'm very glad to be here. I also have to thank the translators who've been doing a marvelous job. I've actually been able to follow the German with their help, so it's all been very good. Maybe you'll be able to follow my English. I'll give you a brief preview of what I'm going to talk about. So what I want to say, the bottom line is that here we are to talk about our conference about secularization and conflict, and I want to say that secularization is not enough. That there is a whole package of ideas that go with that we need to make explicit. It's not enough to just say we don't believe in God. There's a number of things. Even in Dan Barker's talk, I heard these assumptions that if you're godless, of course you're all for democracy and equality and all these good things. We need to make that explicit. So that's what I'm going to say. The rest is just details. If you need to fall asleep now, that's fine. You've got all the important bits. Okay, so where do we find those other values? And I say we find them in the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment was the big event that spawned this culture we have right now. And yes, secularism was part of that, but only part of it. That a big part of the Enlightenment was the promotion of science, in particular empiricism and reductionism. The change in politics, that as Dan was talking about, instead of monarchy, we've got democracies everywhere. The Enlightenment emphasizes democratic input. It also emphasizes individual liberty. This is where the idea of free markets arose. So capitalism is one part of the Enlightenment. Rationalism, the idea that we should question orthodoxies, and, of course, secularism, in some cases even anti-clericism, were important parts of the Enlightenment. Why don't we recognize those enough? It's all of a piece. It all comes together. This is all important in our movement, not just secularism. And I think we generally recognize that the Enlightenment was a good idea. We're for it, right? Anyone against it? I'd like to have a conversation with you after this, but it's very important. It was also a very successful idea. It has shaped how our culture thinks about the world. It's kind of the new orthodoxies of our culture, is this battery of ideas that we associate with the Enlightenment. And to see what I mean, I just want to give a couple of brief examples from popular culture. If you look at literature and the arts, one great example is look at utopias and dystopias, as described by a great many artists. They tell us what we hope for as a society and also what we dread most as a consequence of our society. So an example of a utopia, everyone is familiar with Star Trek, right? Yes, okay, lots of Star Trek. There's Star Trek fans all over the place. I go to science fiction conferences in the United States and it's Star Trek and all these other wonderful, hopeful science fiction stories that are out there. So Star Trek actually pushes Enlightenment values. It's very much an Enlightenment sort of show. So for example, what kinds of things do you associate with Star Trek? Now, bad acting and cheap sets, that's not part of the Enlightenment, okay? These are details. Don't worry about those. But there are things like science. It's very pro-science, pro-technology, pro-research. It's all about exploration, discovering new ideas. That's part of the Enlightenment as well. It's all about diversity. This is important, that it's not just simply white people doing all the action, although, of course, they've got the leads. But, at least they're working towards a little bit more incorporation of diversity. It's about peaceful resolution of conflicts. War is not a big theme in the series. Avoidance of war is. It's about economic equality. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the series, was a humanist, and he had some interesting ideas about economics that in some ways were kind of in defiance of what we got out of the Enlightenment. He's kind of anti-capitalist. He's pro-socialist. Now, that might resonate in European audiences. It kind of gets some people on edge in the United States, but I think it's generally a good thing that one of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment is also flexibility. that what you do is you try to balance all these different ideas you have, and sometimes some ideas have to have less importance than others. And it was, of course, a secular show. Religion did not make an appearance there, although it was also tolerant of religion. So they'd occasionally encounter an alien species with some religion. They'd say, okay, yeah, that's fine. And occasionally they encounter gods who all turned out to be natural and entirely megalomaniac, powerful, horrible creatures. But it was all very secular. And I must also note that one of the ongoing internal conflicts within the show was the conflict between the absolute rationalism of Mr. Spock and the more emotional humanism of McCoy. So an Enlightenment future is not one of placid acceptance of dogma, but appreciation and argument about the contradictions that are inevitably present with any large set of values. So that's an important thing as well, is that we have conversations about what's more important in this situation. We sometimes do have to balance things. Now, another lens that you can use to look at the world is dystopias. And it turns out there's an awful lot of dystopias out there. It makes it hard to choose them, but I'll mention just a few. For instance, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale is a terrific example of the worst possible situation that we could end up in. It also happens to be frighteningly close to where America is going right now. But in that novel, what you find is fear of a number of things, including loss of liberty. So there's a great truncation of individual freedom in that book. Rigid patriarchy, religious rule, and constant war. So those are the things we dread. And again, I don't think there'll be any disagreement within this group that these are all horrible things. We want to end those things. You could also read Orwell's 1984, and you find a whole other set of things that we fear. The surveillance state, loss of privacy, cults of personality, and things like propaganda and obsessive dishonesty from the government. We want the truth. Truth is another Enlightenment value. And these dystopias are the antithesis of the Enlightenment. Now, the popular recognition of these works as dystopian visions, nobody thinks, well, maybe a few do, that's kind of scary, but most people don't think that The Handmaid's Tale is a desirable future, right? And I think that's widely recognized. That tells us that there's a lot of people who agree with us, even if they aren't quite with the atheism part of it. They recognize that there are these values that we should be promoting. And what we ought to be doing is aspiring to live in that Star Trek universe rather than the Handmaid's Tale universe. And that takes work on our part. Now, unfortunately, despite this popularity of this sort of Enlightenment vision of the future, we seem to be drifting the wrong way. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. The first one is my own country, the United States. If any nation gets to claim the mantle of the Enlightenment, it's the U.S. It was founded at the height of the Enlightenment by founders who openly acknowledged the principles of the Enlightenment and codified Enlightenment principles in our Constitution. Hell yes, we ought to be an Enlightenment state, right? We ought to be just the leading Enlightenment state in the world. We ought to be free of religious influence on government because it says so right in our Constitution that we are. We ought to be at the forefront of building an educated citizenry, and we ought to be the most egalitarian nation on earth. Again, the Constitution lays it out for us. We're all created equal. Now, I don't know if you follow the news from the United States, but we aren't. We're kind of the opposite, actually. Many European countries are better representatives of Enlightenment values than we are, and we're actually getting worse. Again, I don't know if you follow the news, but if you look at the candidates for the next presidency from the Republican Party, you should be terrified. These are scary people that are running for office. And there's contradictions here. European countries often have an official state religion, while the U.S. declares that there will be no bias for or against any religion by the government. And what has happened? We have a God-soaked judiciary and Congress, it's almost impossible for an atheist to get elected to high office in my country. We have religious influence tainting our foreign policy. Look at what we were doing in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had a president who actually called it a crusade. So it's poisoning that part of our government. It's poisoning our educational policy. Just as one example, I dare you to look up the Texas state rules on sex education. We're back in the Middle Ages when you look at this stuff. And our domestic policy is dominated by this bizarre obsession with the most naive forms of extreme capitalism. And as I said, the Enlightenment was advanced the idea of free market, but they balanced it with the importance of equality and opportunity. We're all about capitalism, and that's destructive. So what happened in the US? Well, I think it's two things. Right off the bat, we betrayed the important Enlightenment principle of egalitarianism with this idea that we can just pay lip service to equality and freedom while institutionalizing slavery. And what that has led to is a country with this deep, rich legacy of racism. It's being exposed in the news all the time now when you look at what the police are doing to black communities all across America. And you know, we are currently to blame for that, right? We can't say that, well, it's not our fault. It really is our fault, but it's also the fault of our history that has propagated this notion that, yes, we're equal, but some people are less equal than others, and those people can be recognized by their skin color. So we're a terribly unfair nation in many ways. And another motivator of this retreat from the Enlightenment is fear. I got to tell you, I think the United States is the most cowardly nation on earth. It really is. We seem to think the Cold War is still going on, so we must have the biggest bombs, the largest military, and total control of the world because we have enemies out there. The terrorist attack of 9/11 also spawned a further overreaction. Domestic liberties are willingly sacrificed for greater security. Our religiosity is actually a reaction to godless communism. So all these factors have driven us away from those Enlightenment values. And the lesson we ought to learn is that the Enlightenment isn't all one thing. It's not just one idea. It's not just free market capitalism. If you worship free market capitalism, you are an enlightened country. No, that's not true. What you need to do is balance the ideas. Similarly, you can't just say, oh, we're pro-science, so we must be for the Enlightenment. You've got to have this greater balance in order to make for a better world. Nothing is worth sacrificing the great value of equality and opportunity and liberty for all citizens, and that includes security. Okay, what about science? So here's another phenomenon that was a product of the Enlightenment, and that was science. And atheists love science. It provides an alternative explanation for the origin and nature of the universe to religious apologetics. It's also a tool with great power that leads to the technology of the sort that allows me to travel from the center of the US to Germany overnight. A real miracle, an exhausting miracle, but a miracle nonetheless. But it has perils just as well. And I'll mention two examples of this from the history of science in the United States. One is the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. I'm just curious, has anybody here heard of these? A small number of you, okay. This was a terrible series of experiments. Well, from a purely scientific point of view, it made sense. What we had was a population of poor black people in the American South who had come down with syphilis. So let's make them the controls and let's watch them for 30 years and see what happens to them. That's science, right? Very objective, very abstract. Okay, we'll just take these human beings and we won't treat them even when we have penicillin and sulfa drugs and things like this that are effective treatments for syphilis. We're just going to watch them decay for 30 years. And they're black people, and this is the United States, so they don't really count. So this was going on for a long period of time. The disease was allowed to run its course without treatment, even though there were reliable and effective drugs to deal with it. So these were basically human beings sacrificed to scientific curiosity. Now, under science, pure science, unhuman science, that should be legitimate. Sure, yeah, we can do that. We're nihilists. We don't care about human beings. But under a good scientific regimen, that would not happen. Now, the Tuskegee experiments are about 60 years old. So you might be saying to yourself, we've gotten over all that. We know better now, particularly in Germany, where you have a history of the abuses of science. I know that modern Germany is very proactive in dealing with these kinds of problems. Well, in the United States, we have something called the American Psychological Association, which is the organization for all psychologists, academic psychologists all across the country. And they have a set of crystal clear guidelines for what psychologists are permitted to do. And in those guidelines, there's actually a paragraph that explicitly says, no psychologist is allowed to support the use of torture. Right? If you're going to be an American psychologist, a member of this official organization, you can't support torture, which makes sense. I would say you can't be a decent human being and support torture too, but this is a formal organization that lays down this rule. Just this month, though, you can read about it in the New York Times, documents have been uncovered that reveal that representatives of the APA were actively consulting with the CIA and the military to provide justification methods for torture in the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is horrifying. So once again, we have an organization paying lip service in public, saying, no, we don't support torture, and then quietly going off behind the curtains and whispering to the military, here's how you do torture. And that's scary. That should not be happening. So what happened here? Well, I'm going to echo the philosopher Jacob Bronowski on this one. Science is an exquisitely human behavior carried out by human scientists for the purpose of advancing human knowledge. Science without humanism is an abomination without meaning. And all too often, we abandon those humanist principles in the execution of science. So Enlightenment values are of a piece. You cannot simply extract one fragment, whether it's science, whether it's capitalism, whether it's secularism, and say this is sufficient, this is what we're going to promote. Because when you practice one of these principles to the exclusion of all the others, you end up with, for instance, empty empiricism, the accumulation of mere data for data's sake. Which brings me to atheism. What is the problem with atheism? We are here with this theme, the role of secularism in reducing global conflict. And this is a great idea. I do think that secularism can contribute to that reduction. But it's not enough on its own. Once again, we need balance. And this international community needs to commit to far more than just simply rejecting a belief in gods. And talking to many of you, I know that this is in your belief set, that you're not here just because, oh, God doesn't exist, therefore we're done. It's because you have this whole body of other values that you want to see represented in the world. So I've generally found that European audiences are far more appreciative of this idea than American ones. You can't build a productive movement on one idea that there are no gods and that idea alone. You need the whole Enlightenment package. You need to promote equality. You need to promote diversity. You need to promote economic fairness, personal liberty and opportunity, and science and education, as well as rejecting the church. Well, thank you. I got applause for that. That's good. Okay, most of you are going to be in agreement. But I have to add that there are people and forces who oppose those goals. They exist. They're often driven by fear, greed, and ignorance. And we have to acknowledge that we aren't engaged in a unanimously cooperative effort. We are in a struggle, a deep struggle with many people who reject our ideas. We are also divided. There are a number of forces within this movement that are impeding our progress. For one, far too many people demand absolute purity. The atheist secular movement must be focused on just one thing, they say, and all the other baggage must be discarded. It is telling that they seem to regard social justice as mere baggage when it ought to be part of our central core of values. There is, unfortunately, a strong anti-egalitarian streak. And again, I'm going mainly from my American experience with this one, and I'm hoping Europe will be a better leader in this regard. Nothing in my career as a public advocate of atheism has gotten me as much hatred as my embrace of feminism, which was shocking. I desecrated a communion wafer. I got the Catholics outraged. The Catholics were pussycats. They were positively pleasant compared to the people who are furious that I support feminism. And these people are all atheists. And the second greatest source of opposition that I've received is from my insistence that Muslims are human beings and killing them is not a solution to the problem of radical Islam. Now, we also have a problem with authoritarianism. Mentioned the cult of personality earlier. We oppose that sort of thing, so why do we have cults of personality within atheism? Somehow atheism has gotten tangled up in hero worship. People who have made good and worthy intellectual contribution to this movement, which I do not oppose, get labeled as leaders and even heroes. I've grown to hate that word, hero. And they've become the public face of the movement. And all too often, this leads to embarrassment, as it turns out that these leaders, these so-called leaders, are human and may not be so wise in all things. Once again, we need balance, we need to recognize that the power of secularism, the power of atheism, does not come from a few people at the very top, but from the great mass of people who recognize the importance of these values. So I would suggest that before we can claim to be a worldwide force for peace, we have to openly admit to ourselves and the world that secularism is not enough. It is one small piece of a greater goal, which is to promote an enlightened civilization in which all people of all backgrounds and all nations can participate. And that means promotion of more than just disbelief in gods. Okay, do I have time for questions? I would appreciate that. Unless you all agree with me, maybe. Then we're done.
I just wanted to say, and if I'm wrong, correct me, that with those Tuskegee experiments as the control, they were not told that they were the control.
Correct. They
didn't know. They thought they were getting treatment.
That's right. Well, they thought they were getting the best treatment, but the best treatment they were getting was simply they got regular doctor's visits where the doctor would look them over, look at their symptoms, note it, send it off to the scientists. But they were not getting state-of-the-art treatments at all. They were getting no treatment, and they didn't know it. Right. They didn't know that they could get this disease easily cured.
And the other thing is, last thing, sorry, can you explain a little bit about the vaccine thing as a scientist person? In America, out of 50 states, Mississippi and West Virginia are the only two without religious or philosophical exemption towards medical treatment, including vaccines.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yes, another contradiction, isn't it? That some of the most liberal states, most liberal regions are the ones that have the greatest opposition to this. Yeah, California have the greatest opposition to vaccination. And I think that's actually a good thing to note, is that just being secular does not make you wise and all-knowing and sensible, right? In this case, what it is a recognition in those poorer states that there's actually a material good that derives from vaccination. It makes people healthier. You would think if you're a member of a religious group that worships fetuses and babies, that you would think that anything that could protect children from disease would be a wonderful thing. And all too often, those religious people do not. But in those cases, they do. They say, yeah, we've got to do what we can to help the babies. Also, vaccination is cheap. It's far cheaper than taking a kid into the doctor's office to treat them for whooping cough or whatever. So those are also very poor states. So this is another factor that drives them to promote vaccination. It's a way to save money.
And saves lives too.
Well, that's what I would say, is that's the primary value. For poorer countries, sometimes it's just the economic savings that's so good. There's Leo, there's something over here, okay.
Hi, I was wondering if you had made any assessments as to why the opposition towards your support of feminism is so great within the atheist movement.
You know, you try talking to people like this, and it turns out that it's not rational, right? This is not because they've made a rational decision that women, well, they've made an irrational decision that women are inferior. It's also a case of protecting a privilege. If you are a white man in America, you've got it pretty good. I'm pretty lucky in that regard. And there are many people who are very concerned about protecting that status. And what they see is supporting minorities, supporting women, is going to erode the authority of the white man. They literally think that. They literally say that to me, that you're weakening the strength of American manhood.
Hi. Maybe I can shed some positive light on it, because I recently read a study that not only concluded that there are a rapidly growing number of atheists, but within the last 20 years the percentage of women rose from somewhere between I think 15% to above 40%.
That's right. It was like something like 36% of the atheist movement in the United States.
So progress.
Yes, we are making progress. And I think that's what's causing some of the fractures, is that, you know, if you'd asked me 30 years ago and I went to an atheist meeting, what I'd expect is all men. And they'd all be old guys like me now, right? Be an army of clones of me out there. And that's been changing pretty rapidly as we recognize those differences. And also I think, you know, in some ways women seem to be better able to have this enlightened self-interest and recognize that atheism is a better deal for them than subjecting themselves to a patriarchal religion. So we're seeing that growth there. But what we're not seeing is, what we're having difficulty seeing is an appreciation of the contribution of women and minorities to the atheist movement by many of the existing members. And that's leading to opposition.
Okay, did I get you right that you said the 9/11 experience was the reason for America to swing to the religious side?
No, it was one. So the 9/11 experience actually fueled a lot of atheist sentiment. For instance, Sam Harris's books all came out after 9/11 and were very popular because he was tapping into this anti-clerical resentment of Muslims, for instance.
But how do you explain that America itself seems to be a very religious country, at least since the end of the last war? Because I grew up in a little town with a big American community. There was a transportation corps of the army, and I did not learn any American that was not believing in God and could not understand how one could not believe in a God.
Yes, there was one. So there were multiple factors here. One is that 9/11 fueled a lot of atheist sentiment, but also reinforced a lot of religious sentiment. So it kind of split the country in that way. But also it was building on the Cold War experience, which put godly America against the forces of godless communism. You know, things like our Pledge of Allegiance came out of the 1950s, the height of the Cold War, where they added under God to it just to reinforce that whole business of we are the religious country. And I'm sure Dan and Annie Laurie will tell you about that, that yes, there's this deep, deep current of religious tribalism in the United States. Over here.
Hi, my name is Leo Igwe. I'm from Nigeria. I would like you to clarify a bit what you said. Muslims are human beings, and killing Muslims is not a solution to radical Islam. There are some segments of our movement that are saying that killing Muslims is a solution to radical Islam.
Yes, I know. As I said, this is something that gets me a lot of hate mail. Is that I'm told that I'm coddling up to radical Islam, when I'm really not. You know, I think radical Islam is pretty foolish. I disagree with them constantly. I argue with proponents of radical Islam. I'm simply saying something that every humanist ought to recognize, is that every life has value. That includes the value of Muslim lives. That what we ought to be focusing on is not throwing bombs at them, but educating them and giving them opportunities. That a lot of the resentment we see coming from Islamic countries is that we have taken this militaristic approach. That we have decided that the way to solve things is, I heard Christopher Hitchens say that, we've got to throw bombs at Iran because if you've got bodies bouncing in the rubble, they're not going to commit terrorist acts. And again, I'm totally against terrorism. I think that's the wrong solution to anything. If our militarism is increasing hatred of the United States, their militarism and their terrorism, ISIS, for instance, is increasing the hatred of Muslims. It's two forces that are just polarizing the world and leading to greater and greater strife. And somebody has to break that logjam and actually recognize that both sides of this disagreement, deep and profound as it is, are human beings, and that we need to find a humanist solution to this problem. Is that what you need to know? Is that okay?
So I agree what you just said, that the bombs do not help or are to blame with regards to the misery that we experience in the Middle East. And I believe that us, the thinking people, the intellectual people in the Islam countries, haven't done enough. We did not bring forward enlightenment, education. Culture, enlightenment, education cannot be only imported only, but it has to grow from within the culture or the society. And it's based in the foundation of Islam that enlightenment was not accepted. But we are here to do it, to bring things forward anyway.
Yes. No, I agree completely that a solution will not be achieved by one entity like the United States unilaterally telling every nation in the world how they are supposed to be. That I strongly agree with the Enlightenment value of diversity, that we need to see these differences, that we need to appreciate everyone as products of a unique culture. And what that means is, you're exactly right, that these solutions have to arise from within with the help of others outside, but that it's got to be a community effort and it's got to be internally driven.
Hello, and I'm from Iran, and I had lots of suffered about religion in Islamic countries. Even I shift to Malaysia, and my question is how you want to improve a principle that it's against human rights itself in nature, and you want to improve this society and help to remove the terrorism mindset that is in principle and it's in deep nature of Islam. How you want to improve that?
Okay. How am I going to improve Islam? Oh, that's well, as the previous question mentioned, that's not something I can do. That this is something we have to encourage from within. That what will happen is Islamic peoples will improve Islam. And that's, she wants to follow up. So, you know, I don't want to be the totalitarian on the outside who says, well, you're going to read these books, you have to read The God Delusion, or you're not a good secularist. That's not true. That what we have to do is appreciate the wealth of ideas that are everywhere. Okay, Mariam will give us the answer.
Hi everyone. I'm Mariam Namazi. I want to disagree slightly with some of the things that have been said. I think that we do need solidarity across borders, and I think we have to make a distinction between governments and U.S. militarism and Islamist terrorism versus people-to-people solidarity. And I think that's hugely crucial if we're going to win this fight against the religious right. Second of all, I think no society or community is homogeneous. You talk about, the Christian right in the U.S., but there are also huge secular and atheist movements in the U.S. that exists in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia. And so it is, in a sense, I do believe that many of our values are universal. I don't subscribe to cultural relativism. And I think that we need to forcefully be against Islam and all religions. We need to stand firmly against Islamism and the religious right, including the Hindu right, the Buddhist right, that are massacring Muslims in Burma, the Hindu right that has massacred Muslims in Gujarat, for example, the Christian right. But on the other hand, we need to show real solidarity with people and defend universal values because they are universal. And many people in the Middle East and North Africa are fighting and dying for these rights. So we can't forget that. We can't ignore the dissent that exists.
Yes. No, I don't think we disagree at all, actually. I would say that that's entirely true, that that the solution isn't going to be with bombs, although sometimes, when you see ISIS marching across, you kind of think, oh, maybe there are cases where we do need to apply military force. But most of it's going to rise from cultural exchange between human beings, not soldiers. And that we do need that increased solidarity, that we need to identify with other nations as well as our own. Your second point, I'm not arguing for cultural relativism, because I'm actually saying that there are this set of values that arose in the Enlightenment that we want to promote everywhere, that everyone should be democratic, open-minded, value science and art and literature, whatever they may be. And not all cultures share those values. So we need to advance those. And I'm just saying that we don't do that by force. We do that by example and by giving people opportunities to explore these ideas. Okay, I think time is up. Thank you very much.